Welcome, everyone. You're listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. This is the podcast where we explore the evolving maritime landscape and hear from the innovators leading the charge. Today's guest is Dr. Youri Kessler, a veteran in cybersecurity and digital forensics, and one of the founders of the Maritime Hacking Village at DEF CON, a new village at DEF CON spotlighting cyber defenses specific to the maritime industry. Youri has spent decades at the intersection of tech and policy, from academia to federal consulting, and now he's bringing attention to the vulnerabilities and solutions facing modern shipping. I'm excited to dig into this because cybersecurity is often underplayed in our sector, and this effort is rising the bar in a big way. Youri, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
So, love to hear a little bit about your background, which is really interesting, and kind of how did you find your way into maritime? Like, after doing all the things you've done, cybersecurity and all the really cool stuff, how did you end up on the maritime side? Which, you know, we joke around about the name of the podcast, The Last Dinosaur. This is kind of the last horizon for all digital aspects, including cybersecurity.
Well, I am aware that the podcast is called The Last Dinosaur, and sometimes, particularly if I listen to my children and grandchildren, I am a dinosaur. So I've been involved with computers. I took my first computer programming class as an undergraduate, now 52 years ago, 1973, and I accidentally crashed my first mainframe in 1974. That was probably a function of having taken my first programming class in 73. But as I progressed in my graduate programs in computer science, I found that there were various ways of breaking computers that, to me, like, this is such an obvious vulnerability. Why is nobody doing anything about it? But of course, nobody would take you seriously unless you actually, provided a proof of concept kind of thing. So I helped break a mainframe at the University of Arizona in about 1976. And we took this information to the techs because, of course, at that time, they were all big computers. We had techs on site. And we said, hey, you know, if you do X, Y, and Z, you'll crash this computer. And their response was, well, don't do that. Okay. You know, that was cyber defense in 1976. And okay. All right. And then at my next graduate school at the University of Arizona, same kind of thing. And I found a way of stealing people's login credentials. And once I did that one time, I ran to my buddies in the computer center and said, hey, look, you can do this. And they said, oh, yeah, we sort of know that. Well, don't do that. And like I said, I was called a hacker in the mid-70s before hackers usurped the term. But I grew up in Southern California, been on the water my whole life. I was certified as a scuba diver when I was in my teens in the mid-1960s. I had friends who had boats. So, boating and the water have always been a part of my life. And in fact, I went to school originally because I wanted to study oceanography. For a number of reasons, I ended up in mathematics and computer science instead. But be that as it may. And so, my career, as you observed, has taken a bunch of paths. I got interested in cybersecurity back in the late 1970s. We didn't call it cybersecurity then. We called it a bunch of other things. And I actually probably want to address that a little bit later on. But about 8 years ago, I was teaching at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. And when they hired me at Riddle and found out I had a captain's license, they were very excited until they found out that kind of captain's license, in which case they were no longer interested. But I accidentally... Well, no, it wasn't accidental. I was preparing some course material on aviation cybersecurity, and I stumbled upon some information, just not much, but a very little about maritime. And I used to think that aviation cyber was a mess until I discovered maritime cyber. And I stumbled upon any number of things that were like really interesting research topics to me. And most specifically was the automatic identification system, AIS, because deep down, I'm a techie and I'm a network protocol guy. And I haven't written code for money probably in 40 years, but I discovered some of the flaws with AIS, and I decided I wanted to learn more about those. I wanted to figure out mechanisms for, well, how would I protect AIS if I could? And I came up with some half-baked scheme, but I built a demonstration of capability. And then I decided, well, spoofing AIS isn't that hard. Maybe what we need are tools to do it better. So for the last 8 years, my focus has been on maritime. And, my COVID-19 2020 project was to write a book. But my real area of research has been on things to do with AIS.
So that is one of the biggest and hottest topics. And I'd like to morph that into, or lead that into, kind of how did you go from all of that to coming up with this great idea of going to DEF CON and then trying to create a Maritime Hacking Village? And just step it back a second, because I don't know a lot about DEF CON until we started talking about it. Talk about DEF CON, what it is, and now what it means to have a village dedicated to one specific area. Because I think the way I kind of thought about it in the beginning, like, oh, you just pay some money and you set up some booths. But when you and I talked, it's a little bit more, and it kind of gives the credence that maritime is becoming on people's radar. Sorry, the pun, or the inside joke maybe, but maritime is on the radar of people outside of maritime. I want to hear a little bit about that story, because I think that evolution and your involvement with DEF CON and then developing this Maritime Hacking Village the first year coming up here in August, I'd love to hear about that.
So for those who may not be familiar with DEF CON, DEF CON is, as it says, it is a hacker conference, but it is hacker these days. It really is, when I refer to hacking and hackers, it really is more in the sense of the 1970s way in which we use the word. It is people who are curious and creative and want to pound on things in order to break them so that they can then figure out how to fix them. So DEF CON, I should have known this better. I believe that DEF CON is now in its 33rd year. And so it's been around since, obviously, the early 90s. And the way DEF CON is organized, because, a couple tens of thousands of people go to DEF CON. And the primary way in which DEF CON is organized is into the specialty areas by village. So there's an AI village, there's a biohacking village, there's an aviation village, industrial control system, automobiles, the list goes on and on. It's not an infinite list, because DEF CON will only allow X number of villages, because we're now in the Las Vegas Convention Center and there is only so much room. But be that as it may, maritime has had a presence there for several years. And I sort of got engaged in this because some of my AIS research, where I came up with a proof of concept, as I mentioned, to, how can I secure this? I had a couple of colleagues say, you should talk about that at DEF CON. So starting in about 2020 or 2021, I was involved with the maritime activities, but maritime was always in somebody else's village. So it was like, we've got a village for whatever, and we're going to give maritime a little bit of space, and we'll give you a couple speaker slots, and, we'll give you a 10 by 10 space on the floor. And as maritime, of course, has emerged as a very, very important topic of conversation, I actually approached one of my colleagues, Nina Collars from the U.S. Naval War College, who was one of the people who dragged me into DEF CON in the first place. And I said, we need a village of our own. It's time we grow up and become adults and get a village of our own. And we drafted our third founder, Duncan Woodbury, who's our executive director. And so Duncan and Nina and I went through the gyrations of putting together the village, creating the nonprofit, putting in the proposal to DEF CON, getting the proposals accepted, and now trying to organize all the stuff that we plan on doing there to provide a place that if somebody was interested in only maritime cyber and didn't care about anything else going on at DEF CON, we have a place that would keep them busy for 2.5 days.
And one of the things that you do for keeping people busy, besides what you mentioned, things like speakers and stuff that you've done before, is you actually try to engage with companies that have products that allow the hackers to pound on them.
Correct.
Use your terminology. Talk a little bit about kind of what you're thinking of, and maybe you don't want to give away any of the special sauce on who's going to be there, but what types of companies are you talking to now that's going to provide, whether it's software, and it's not just software, it's also hardware? Because we had this discussion, I think, back in January, February, you mentioned, I think it was under the biohacking one, there was some sort of imaging technology. So it was a piece of hardware that somebody brought in, and they give the hackers a bunch of hours, and then they said, yep, we've exposed all these vulnerabilities. And then they go through. Hopefully, are you going to have something like that at this year's Hacking Village?
Yeah. So it is a combination of a lot of things. DEF CON is absolutely positively not a vendor type of conference. You won't see the typical exhibit that you'll see at a typical, industry conference. DEF CON is designed to be very, very much hands-on. So without giving any pre-announcements, I can tell you who our sponsors are. The American Bureau of Shipping is one of our bigger sponsors.
That's a nice get. Yep, they're pretty forward-leaning. Yep.
Yeah, pretty much. And Dispel, Havoc AI, and 10 Solutions and the Maritime Cybersecurity Institute are among our sponsors. And so what we are planning to have is, well, first of all, one big integrated capture the flag. So attendees at DEF CON vary from the very, very techie to, in fact, managers who want to just know a little bit more about, well, first of all, what is it they're managing and who is it they're managing? And even among the techies, we get some people that have never been to a DEF CON before and people who have been coming for the last 20 years. And so in the Capture the Flags, we're going to be covering things like understanding the NMEA 2000 protocol that is used very widely on actually pretty much yacht class and smaller vessels. NMEA 0183, which is really used on some of the larger Solus class vessels, and some of the other protocols that you might see in product. We're going to, of course, have GPS gear and AIS gear, propulsion stuff. Many of the vendors there are actually bringing equipment that will be connected to our little Capture the Flag network. So the idea of a Capture the Flag, by the way, is we give you a set of challenges. And the idea is you go through the challenges, and as you successfully answer the question, answer the challenge, what have you, you get points. And the winner is whoever accumulates the most points. For somebody who's never done a CTF before and doesn't know a lot about the various protocols, well, you can still play the game, because the game is designed to help actually step you through it. And if you're a newbie, well, you're probably not going to win the CTF, but you will acquire a lot of hands-on knowledge. And you'll see some of the tools that people are going to be using to, help get that knowledge. And we're also going to have a war game that we're planning, some tabletop exercises. We're going to have several speakers and a couple of panels. Primarily, the biggie right now that we're organizing is a policy panel. And so, it's all that kind of stuff. One of the areas that we're focusing on this year or including this year and not really had much of an opportunity in the past is having some autonomous vessels. Because, of course, mariners are acutely aware of the collision regulations. I will tell you that the mere boater has no idea that there's a collision regulation, and people outside of our field, they don't know anything about a call rig.
Right, a call rig, yeah.
But,
they're sitting on
of
my
course,
desk behind me, actually.
when yeah, there you go. So if I've got an autonomous vessel, for example, and in this case I mean crewless, there's nobody on board. Okay, well, how do I deal with that pesky rule that says you have to maintain a lookout? Well, of course, you're going to do that by having a whole crap load of sensors and cameras, right? They're going to have to be communicating back to the faux captain.
Virtual bridge, I guess, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, sitting in my office with, a whole bunch of monitors. But that means I've got radio communication or wireless communication of some sort. And I got to tell you, if you're going to have wireless communication shipped to shore, there is a way that somebody's going to be able to crack that. So that is an important consideration. So the use of AI is something that, of course, is becoming prevalent in our industry. Autonomy is becoming prevalent in our industry. And so that's something that we are trying to represent at the Village as well.
Right. And let's build out. I mean, what are you talking about stepping away from the Village, but in general? And I guess maybe this is part of the themes. Is what are some of the biggest threats? I mean, you talk about spoofing AIS. Obviously, that's been, I think, around for a while. Maritime is vulnerable to all the other threats that offices are, whether it's spear phishing or phishing, or getting a text from somebody saying that this Connecticut DMV, you owe money, which I literally got one of those about an hour ago.
Right.
Saying all of that. And in the age of greater ship-to-shore connectivity, especially in the light of Starlink, what are some of the big threats in maritime cybersecurity that you see beyond some of the things that you talked about? Or maybe you want to expand on those things.
Sure. Well, you did leave out one of my personal favorites, and that is, let's take a USB thumb drive and drop it on the deck.
Boy, I thought we actually moved past that. That's why I didn't bring it up. I thought everybody knows about that.
Oh, no, that's an oldie but a goodie. So let me start with a little bit of a soapbox, because this is why you brought me here, right? So I hate the word cybersecurity, and I will tell you why. It's only fair that I tell you why. I've been in the field, like I said, since the late 70s. And, we had information security, computer security, network security, information assurance, and all that kind of stuff. And somebody in Congress decided, 15 or so years ago, that those words weren't sexy enough. So now we get cybersecurity. My concern with the word cybersecurity is that people focus on cyber. And by cyber, I mean they focus on computers and networks. And what they miss is we really have to focus on information, because that's really what we're trying to protect. Now, I'm not an idiot. I know computers store information. Networks are our conduit of moving information around. I get that. But my point is that if you look at information in terms of confidentiality, integrity, availability, authenticity, possession, utility, those characteristics of information, and you can look at any cyber event back into the 1700s, well, maybe 1800s, when the telegraph boys were playing with telegrams before they would deliver them. Everything is an attack on one or more of those characteristics of information. And our focus has to be, how do we make sure that the characteristics of information that we care about remain intact? So having said that, you did ask, though, a fair question. What are some of the key threats? So certainly GPS spoofing, attacks on navigation systems, and now by this I will include AIS spoofing as well. This is probably one of the biggest ones that I worry about. Probably because it's the area of my research, so I know more about it. But it's also cheap and easy to attack that stuff. GPS is a little harder. AIS is simplicity itself. If I can build tools to spoof AIS, then I assure you that our enemies can do it probably as well, if not better. But I've already mentioned autonomy is going to be something that we really need to concern ourselves with. It is amazing to me how long we've been talking about autonomy. And we started talking about autonomy in maritime at least a decade ago. And it took a long time before anybody started to say, well, if I'm going to build an autonomous vessel, maybe I need to think about some, securing the information. AI is obviously going to play a big role in cybersecurity in general, and of course in maritime as well. And the biggest issue with AI, of course, is that AI is dependent upon good information. So if somehow I'm able to feed an AI system bad information, it will make bad decisions. So
yeah, I had somebody say, and he wasn't talking about AI, he was talking about a platform. He said garbage in instead of garbage out. He said garbage in. No, he said garbage in, danger out.
Oh yeah, no, true.
Which I thought was pretty good. That was Ali Riaz. He's a CEO of Orbit MI, and we were talking about it, and he said, that's the biggest thing. And I think he was talking about decision making on, let's say, commercial side, right? So for emissions and for, should I charter this ship? But really it could be, taking the true sense of the word danger. And that's kind of where I think, you're going at.
Well, let's ignore AI for just a second and talk about the concept of smart ports, smart ships, smart containers.
Yes, I want to talk about ports because I think people miss that a lot. They don't talk much about port.
But, the idea that I could be the master of a vessel and I have a dashboard that tells me the complete state of my boat, from the torque on the propeller shaft to the stress on my mooring lines to every other thing I could possibly think of on the ship. Now, first of all, that is an enormous amount of data. And now I've got the sensors and the technology to gather it, and I have the human-machine interface models. I know how to display it, but it is so much information. A, you practically need an AI to help you know what to look at. But B, we are now so dependent and reliant on that information being correct and authentic and available. Again, back to the characteristics of information. And that then, to me, continues to be one of the incredibly important factors. And then there's two other things I would note here. One of them is workforce development. There are a lot of people in maritime, many of them sitting in the engineering department right as we speak, who would be ideal people to train up to be a first line of defense for cyber on a boat. Now, when we talk about putting people out in the cybersecurity workforce, and we've got 1 million people, too few people doing cybersecurity. There's a tier system and a spectrum, if you will, of what knowledge people need to have to be a cybersecurity practitioner. What I'd like to see on every boat is somebody who's cyber aware enough that when I find the USB thumb drive on the deck, I know that there's somebody on the boat I should bring it to and say, what do we do with this? Is there a safe place? We can do whatever it is we're going to do. And we constantly blame people as being the weakest part of cybersecurity. And I think that that's a little bit unfair because it implies that I'm giving you good software that is secure and the human is misusing it. I'm giving the human user Windows. Try being secure in a Windows environment. Sorry, that's not the user's fault. Users do make dumb errors. I know, I get that. But again, we're not giving them secure enough systems. And I observe, and I won't go into this here with you, but I would happily accept the challenge somewhere else. But I will preface this by saying I have a master's in computer science and a PhD in computing technology and education. When I observe, we are writing the same crappy code today that we were writing 25 years ago. So that's also part of the workforce development is we need to be writing more secure systems. And we don't.
Saying that, I mean, thinking about this now from a policy point of view and industry readiness, are we, because of the crappy code, which sounds like it's not a maritime industry, but we have to live with it. I mean, how, and this whole concept of kind of having people who are cyber aware so that you could, take doesn't look right and I'll bring it to somebody. How prepared are we for these sort of modern cyber threats and attacks that we kind of are in the world that we live in?
So let me climb up on another small soapbox. DEF CON, I mentioned, was 33 years old, right? This is a demonstration that the hacker community has been running circles around the computer science community for at least 33 years. We have allowed ourselves to believe that only super educated techies and, in some quarters, computer scientists are the only one that can teach anybody anything about a computer or security. What I need in a cyber defender is somebody who has imagination, is a critical thinker, is creative. Obviously, they need to know the technology, but they need to know how to think outside of the box, or more importantly, they need to know how to think within the box that does exist. And when it comes to policy, I think we need to figure out a way of expanding who we allow into the, so-called cybersecurity ranks. Within maritime specific, though, I mean, that turns out to be one of the other big problems, because who is going to come up with the policy that is going to be accepted internationally? And even let's take the Coast Guard rules that have now, are now out, and they finally approved them. And I think they go into effect July 16th or something like that. So who is subject to the Coast Guard rules? Well, if you're a vessel nowhere near a United States port, then you're obviously not going to have to comply with those rules. And yet, your ship may be anchored in a slip or in a mooring next to a boat that will be coming into U.S. waters. Is it possible for one boat to infect another? And the answer is sure, you betcha. And there's been all sorts of models and tabletop exercises and simulations about that as well. So the industry has a ton of recommendations, from the class societies to the regulatory authorities to IMO. And one of the things I have discovered with maritime is that, IMO can only do so much. In many cases, it's going to be the insurers that force compliance because, if they would stick to their guns, they won't insure you if you don't have coverage.
Yeah. And I think that actually can go one step on the commercial side is that I think charterers or, the people who lease the ships can also be an active member of, it would be very easy for them to just simply say, do this rule, but then on their own tonnage and because going into their own terminals, they could end up being at risk, right? It's almost like a clean bill of health. Yeah, I think it's very important because I think the charters are going to have a say on that. I mean, how would you suggest fixing that approach? Like you said, the IMO can only do so much. And I think that the IMO focus, to their credit, is on the emissions, and they're really working on, the post MEPC 83. They're going to have a special session coming up. So they're really focusing on the emissions and the calculation and all that good stuff. What would you think about a way to improve cybersecurity on the maritime space? How do you think we should approach this if the IMO is too distracted? And like you said, the Coast Guard, maybe it's limited in its scope to enforce, what would you say to that?
Well, one thing I think we need to do within the industry is make cyber awareness, if you will, address it as a safety issue. And so I think that we need to view cyber as much a safety issue as how long are your fire hoses? How many lengths do you need, from the hydrant? How many PFDs do you have? Things like that. I think also, interestingly, professional mariners need more awareness. And in the United States, I don't know that the merchant marine academies are able, for one reason or another, to add cybersecurity, even awareness level, into their curricula. I have spoken with several merchant marine academies, largely in Europe and one in Asia, where they are putting it into their programs. I think that's where it needs to start. I mean, the professional mariner, every professional mariner needs to have some awareness of this. And that comes into, how do I alter the culture? And actually, to a certain degree, I don't know that I blame maritime too terribly much. I remember when the internet started to go public in the early 90s. And we used to talk about people should have a web surfing license before they can get on the web.
Boy, that would change a lot of things, I'm sure.
Wouldn't that? So 30 years later, 30 plus years after the first browser, do we still have people who will click on any damn thing that comes their way? You betcha. So why would maritime be any different than the rest of the general population?
Do you think that one of the big things is for companies just simply to extend training, and we all go through it if you work for any company of any size, whether it's, a 30, anything probably over a dozen or so people, everybody kind of gets this sort of mandatory training. And maybe that's a good way to kind of bridge that gap, is to make sure that, look, we're going to connect you now with Starlink. We think it's worthwhile because of the positive implications to talking to your family, to being connected on social media. And again, I'm not saying, the kind that can infect you, but, the normal email.
Sure.
Streaming Netflix and those sort of things. But I think that if you treat the seafarers as you treat, somebody in sales who sits at a desk or a head of product management, and you treat that seafarer the same ways, maybe that's a great way to kind of really approach cybersecurity overall, that you make sure that they have a drumbeat of training.
Sure. Well, I actually have two quick items that I would say on that. First of all, I think that most of the annual training I don't want to say it's worthless, but it is not worth the money we spend on it. And the reason is, well, let me ask you a question. When was the last time you took your 1 hour annual training on the use of Microsoft Word? And you're going to say, I don't do that. That's the dumbest question I've heard today. And the reason you don't get training on Microsoft Word is because you use Microsoft Word every day. So you don't need training on how to use Microsoft Word. So by giving you 1 or 2 hour of annual training on cybersecurity, the shelf life is probably about a week and a half, because there's no follow-up to it and there's no practice of it. I think the best training we can give to the general awareness level, low-level person is, how are you going to protect your communication with your family, as you just alluded to? How are you going to protect your bank account? How are you going to do all these things that directly impact you, but that will make you more cyber aware? And then we can say, oh, by the way, the ship's propulsion system is just like your bank account, and let them take what affects them personally and bring it to work.
Right. And I also think the other piece to this, and you do see the rise of seafarers that have a large social media presence, which I think is good, because I feel that we suffer in this industry from something called sea blindness, meaning nobody really cares about seafarers until they run out of toilet paper at Walmart, right? Nobody really cares until they don't have gas at the pump. Nobody cares, right? Until that happens. So you have these wonderful seafarers, and some of them are more social in nature, like, oh, look at the sunrise and blah, blah, blah. Some are really informative. Captain Kate McClure, who's now the head captain and seafarer, I believe now at Four Seasons Cruises. She went from wherever she was to Four Seasons to take their new ship out and all that good stuff. And I think that's positive. But I think there's also a level of people that I talk to just to be a little bit careful of, what are you showing in the background? Is that leaving us a vulnerability? And I don't think the answer from shipping companies is you can't do it. It's, well, we have protocols on, we wouldn't allow our staff accountant to walk around the office because we have whiteboards behind us with information. So if you want to go outside on the aft deck on the fantail where you're just taking a picture of the dolphins and maybe, something, right, that doesn't give away, what type of equipment you're using or so on, then maybe that's okay. But I think a lot of it comes from policy and guidelines from the office not to treat seafarers any different than how they treat their office staff.
I agree. And I think most people aren't aware of concepts, as you've just alluded to, of information leakage and operational security. And why would that affect me anyway? I mean, I am a low AB. All I do, I'm a wiper.
I'm a wiper. I'm a junior third mate. I'm a steward. Yeah, exactly. But I do think that you put it in the same context. Well, you're equally as important as the junior accountant or somebody else that, some associate that is just very happy in their level and they're not going to move up. But we want to be careful about what they do in the office because, again, we may have some privilege.
Yeah, absolutely.
You just have to be aware. And I think that that's one of the biggest gaps is just companies realizing that seafarers want to be people too. And as you unloosen the chain of communication with respect to products like Starlink and others that will come about, I think there's a need there. This has been fantastic. But as we wrap up, I'll ask you what you're reading. Given you kind of teased a little bit, you wrote a book during COVID about AIS and cybersecurity. Are you writing anything as well, or are you just reading a lot of stuff, or are you just reading on hacking villages for dummies?
No, I'm actually not working on another book. I do try to work on making sure that the Maritime Cybersecurity book, at least gets, some annual updates. And I write the occasional paper here or there. Actually, the area of AIS I'm working right now is the intersection of AIS and OSINT, open source intelligence, and primarily working with some colleagues on the tracking of the dark fleet, ghost fleet, whatever we want to call it, primarily moving sanctioned goods, primarily right now from Russia. But, it's a microcosm. If you can do that, you can do others.
Right, yeah.
But actually, the book I'm reading right now, and I had a look at the title this morning. I'm reading Fever Beach by Carl Hyacin, because sometimes I just need to empty my head. And Carl Hyacin is always a good read, particularly for those of us living in Florida.
Of course, and he just had the what was it, Apple? That was his books, right? That with Vince Vaughn.
Oh, yeah. The monkey, the something monkey.
Bad Monkey.
Yeah, that's it. Bad Monkey.
That was a very, very good show. If you haven't seen the show, Vince Vaughn was just, I would say, pitch perfect on that. You really felt you were living in the Keys / Miami. I think I wanted to, have a Cuban sandwich and, drink some sort of drink and hang out on the beach after each episode. It was a good cleanser. I think I watched that during the middle of the winter.
Yeah, I do. I do like a good Cubano.
Yes, exactly. Dr. Kessler, Gary, thank you so much for coming on. Really quick, I don't normally do this because, normally it's not an infomercial, but given what you're trying to do with the Hacking Village, what I think is important to the industry, talk a little bit about how people can get involved if they want to get involved, because there's plenty of time. It's going to be during the middle or early end of August. Talk about how people get involved, whether you're a company or an individual, potential speaker, sponsor, so on.
Well, certainly contact us quickly, please. We do have a website at www.maritimehackingvillage.com. We are on LinkedIn. You can contact me at whatever contact information you post about me, or kess@maritimehackingvillage.com. And if you want to volunteer, we have a volunteer form. If you want to sponsor, we still have a sponsor form. And regardless of 25, we're already looking ahead to 2026.
I really appreciate you coming on, because I think it's important for the community to get together. And again, it's also helping solve the problem of sea blindness. We are just, a part of some other hacking community, and now we have our own. And I think that's a super achievement for the industry as a whole, and wonderful to see that come to fruition for you, Gary. It's great stuff. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for the opportunity.